Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome back. Today I'm joined with my dear friend and economist Dan Boudreaux. He's a senior fellow at the Mercatus Center, a professor of economics at George Mason University, and one of the most compelling public defenders of free market principles working today. He's also here to discuss his powerful new book, The Triumph of Economic Freedom, Debunking the 7 Great Myths of American Capitalism, that he co-authored with former U.S. Senator Phil Gramm. In this book, Don and Senator Gramm take aim at some of the most pervasive and enduring myths about American capitalism, myths that have shaped public opinion, distorted policy debate, and weakened our collective confidence in the power of markets to lift people out of poverty and deliver prosperity. From the false narrative that industrial revolution make workers worse off to the myth that trade hollowed out American manufacturing, we'll talk a lot about that, to the claim that deregulation caused the financial crisis, this book is a sweeping, data-driven rebuttal to the economic storytelling that has come to dominate, very sadly, popular culture and much of modern politics. They have also a very powerful quote at the beginning. They write, "We dedicate this book to America, not the idealized, shining city on the hill, but rather an unfinished work of free people who thrive and often fail to live up to their high principle, but who then learn from their mistakes and perpetually rededicate themselves to the task." It's a timely reminder that the American experience in economic liberty is not just alive, but worth defending. Don, welcome to the show.
I'm very happy to be here, Vera.
So before we start, I want to ask you first, how did you become an economist? What's the path for you? How did you become such a defender of free markets and economic freedom? And how did you become really also, why did you specialize in trade?
So I was very lucky, and like so many people in my generation in the U.S. I was very lucky. I didn't plan to stay in college. I was the oldest of 4. My mother wanted me to go to college, so I figured, okay, I'll go for a year. And so I didn't care about college at all. My second semester, I needed a Monday, Wednesday class because I was working part-time at the shipyard where my parents worked, my dad worked. And so I got this class, this economics class. I had no idea what economics was. I got stuck in this class. And I had a great teacher. Shows the importance of a great teacher. No one's ever heard of her. She died in 2014, Michelle Francois. And so this is 1977, January of 1977. I'm in this class. And in the U.S. in 1973, so just 6 years early, 3 years earlier, really, there were the first nationwide gasoline shortages since World War II. Mm-hmm. And literally the first, and I got my driver's license in September of 1973. And I wanted to drive a car by myself, but my parents wouldn't let me. You had to have my grandma in the car, or, my dad. I had to have an adult. The first time I drove a car by myself was in 1973 in November. My dad gave me the keys to the car and said, "Go fill the car up." I waited in a gasoline line. And so people of my generation remembered those 1973 gasoline shortages. I got in this economics class, and Michelle Francois draws a supply and demand curve on the chalkboard. She says, "You remember," because we did, "you remember the gasoline lots? Well, here's why they existed." And she showed a price ceiling. And, I had all these wacky theories in my head before that. We were running out of oil. Oil companies are greedy. And I saw that supply and demand graph and showing a price ceiling. And when a price ceiling, of course, is a price set below the market clearing price, and you get a shortage. And one consequence of a shortage is people wait in line. And that was like the scales coming from my eyes. I thought, this is beautiful. What a wonderful, simple explanation, compelling explanation of a real world phenomenon that I experienced, and really I realized then had no good explanation for until I encountered economics. And so she was a great teacher. And I had other teachers at Nichols State University, where I did my undergraduate work, who were wonderful. They were devoted to the classroom, and they happened to be very free market, not in any sort of Ayn Rand way. They were free market because they read Milton Friedman, they read Hayek, they read Sowell, and they introduced me to the works of Friedman, Hayek, and Sowell, and James Buchanan a little bit later. And so I was introduced early on to the Austrian school. I was introduced early on to the importance of decentralized decision-making and the reality that decentralized economic decision-making leads to really beautiful, complex economic outcomes that no human mind could possibly plan ahead of time. So this was early on for me. By the time I was 19 or 20 years old, I was fully on board with the spontaneous order of the market economy. Now, I understand it a lot better now than I did when I was 20. I continue to learn. But the short answer is I had really good teachers as an undergraduate. And they were not just good teachers, they were also committed to the classical liberal market order. And they instilled that in me. How I became a trade economist, that's a little bit more recent. I early on specialized in antitrust. And fortunately, not for my career, but fortunately for the world, for the US, by the time I was really maturing as a young scholar, antitrust had become dormant. It didn't disappear, but it kind of went into a coma, largely because of the work done at the University of Chicago and UCLA on the importance of recognizing how markets can be competitive without having any kind of government oversight. So I went to law school in order to learn more about antitrust. I got out of law school and got a teaching job at Clemson University. And there was no one in Clemson who taught the economics of trade. And so I'm a little man on the totem pole. And there was a trade course taught to MBA students that the economics department taught. And I was told, well, you got to teach this trade course. And when I was in graduate school at NYU several years earlier, because I wanted to take a class from Fritz Machlup, who was still teaching then, I took an international trade course from Fritz Machlup. I didn't think I'd specialize in it. I enjoyed the course a lot and learned a lot, but it wasn't my specialty. I just wanted to take a course from a great, well-known, famous economist. So I got to Clemson and I had to teach international trade. Mm-hmm. And since then, I just fell in love with the subject. And things are worse now in this Trump era, but it's always the case, as you know, that there are pleas for protectionism and spurious cases being made for how if we protect this industry or that industry, that'll somehow enrich us all. And it's enjoyable for me to figure out ways to address these fallacies. I mean, they've been addressed constantly throughout history by people far more talented than me, but they still need to be addressed. And so I'm trying to do my little bitty part.
Well, actually, I think I think first you're way too modest about this because you're like literally like you're tired. You just like never tire of doing it. And you do it in a way that's actually very compelling and very effective. But it's also there just really aren't that many people who are specialized in trade economics. It's kind of surprising. I remember it just took a long time for me to kind of to kind of realize how important trade was. But I think it's because also probably in the last 40 years it was still important, but it wasn't as kind of like at the center of kind of the fight, because in a way, a lot of our ideas, a lot of the free trade ideas had not just won in the academic world, but in the policy world and even in politics. Now, they were implemented very, not as purely as we would have liked. But so as a result, there were just like, I guess, few people entering the field. And now that actually kind of protectionism is back on the scene, I think you see more people flocking to actually studying trade economics, so I mean it's a good thing that people like you continued actually putting pressure for free trade.
Well, I think it is. I mean, both just for the logic of the case. I mean, you don't want to have governments acting under false pretenses that somehow what they're doing is good for the economy when it's not. But also to the extent that you are, and I certainly am, as a normative matter, committed to a peaceful, prosperous, open society. We know from history that when economic nationalism rises, that not only does that reduce economic growth, possibly reverses economic growth, the worst consequence is it increases the probability of a hot shooting war, and which of course it's also bad economically, but it's terrible. People get killed and civil liberties get trampled upon. So maintaining an open global trading system is important, yes, for economic prosperity, but even more important for world peace. And so it's good to do whatever part we can do to continue to make that case.
Not to mention that it's infuriating to think that government officials think they can tell us, people, what we can and cannot buy, and impose a surtax on us if we decide to buy stuff that this disapprove of. But so let's talk about the book. It's exciting. It's coming out this week. The cover is beautiful.
Thank you.
I have to say, and it's incredibly timely. It's like we're really at a time where a lot of these myths that you're addressing kind of like are at the center stage, really, of a lot of the kind of the running beliefs that we see even among Republicans, because like we're at this weird junction where a lot of Republicans, including the president and some of his closest advisors, I mean, they sound like Democrats. They really sound like, and these are a lot of myths that actually have been really kind of pushed on the left side of the spectrum. Right.
And now we see him being pushed from the right as well.
Yeah. And so it's just really, really timely. So I want to start with this, the dedication that I really like at the beginning of the book. And so why did you guys emphasize America as an unfinished work? And what did you decide to start the book with this note?
So I have to credit my co-author Phil Gramm for that that little epithet. He came up with it. He ran it by me. I think maybe I tweaked a word or two, but it's mostly him. But I agree with it completely. It's unfinished because every society is ongoing, of course, and as our old late colleague Walter Williams used to often say, that America is the last great hope of civilization. It's a little bit of a hyperbole, maybe, but there is one thing that's unique about the United States. It's a creedal nation, as George Will puts it. It's a nation not built on a religious ethic. It's a nation not built on ethnic groups. It's built on a creed. And the creed is stated very clearly in the opening of the Declaration of Independence. And so that creed, that all men are created, all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, this is a soaring aspiration. America, I maybe this will sound a little bit nationalistic of me. I hope not, but I think America has come closer, certainly, than most nations to achieving that for its people, but it hasn't achieved it fully. And securing that achievement is an ongoing process. So I think that's the unfinished part. No matter how good things are today, you and I, remember, you're a little bit younger than me, but we were both adults when Ronald Reagan was in office in the U.S. and Margaret Thatcher was in office in the U.K. And things seem to be, and then a few years later the Berlin Wall comes down and the Soviet Union dissolves. Things seem to be moving in the right direction. Oh, great! End of history, as Francis Fukuyama put it. It wasn't the end of history. Things looked really good in the 1980s for those of us who love liberty. But things don't look so good today. And
no.
So these ideas have to be kept going. And the United States being what it is, being so large, being so dynamic, being such an historical exemplar of the liberty principle, I think Americans do have a uniquely important role to play in history to keep that liberty flame fueled.
Yeah, when I read, so I had two thoughts when I read this dedication. The first thing is like I do think that America is a shining city on the hill in a way comparatively to the rest of the world. I mean, it really kind of is the closest we have to this idealized kind of, goal, like the thing where you and I are fighting for at all time. But I also kind of thought about, like when you say that the work of free people who thrive and often fail to live up to their high principles, but then learn from their mistakes and perpetually rededicate themselves to the task. I thought about this is why we love markets too.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the parallel is precisely because in markets are the mechanism by which those free people can precisely do this, learn from their mistakes and
excellent point.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just like it. I don't know. I really liked it. So
thank you. There's a parallel in it. Before you ask me one more question, I just want to say something about Phil Gramm and about the book that references something you said earlier when we were talking about trade. Phil Gramm is a PhD economist, quite accomplished PhD economist, by the way, before he entered politics, and a very good one. But he's also committed to the liberal principles that you and I are committed to. He calls them conservative principles, but he's a liberal in the correct use of that term. And when he talks about trade, to me personally, and I've heard him talk to other people about it, he can give all the economic arguments for why protectionism is economically bad, but he will ultimately come down and say, I've heard him this very often, he will ultimately come down and say, look, the real root problem of protectionism is that it's an unjust interference with people's freedom. It's a moral issue first.
Yeah.
But, a lot of people, those kind of normative arguments aren't persuasive enough to them. So they like to get the consequentialist arguments, which we give in the book.
Yeah. And it's kind of one of the things that's so disturbing about the current moment, right? It's like, and you and I have actually said this in the past, and I guess we've changed our mind now. We'd say how as bad as Donald Trump is, one of the things he doesn't want to do is reorganize societies like the left wants to do. And actually the push for protection is especially the way it is done is actually really an attempt.
Yes.
To reorganize society to tell people what they can do, cannot do, kind of decide which industries win and which one aren't. Now he's pushed it even to actually tell parents how many dolls they should be allowing their kids to have and how many pencils we have. And also has actually decided for all of us that, the dream would be for our children to work in factories.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like this weird, so it is really a moral issue. It's like literally he wants to reorganize society.
Yep. He's turned out to be much more of a social engineering type than I initially thought.
Yeah.
But
we always knew that tariffs was bad, but it was like, but this is like they're pushing it to a level that's like totally insane.
It's, I think, insane comes very close to describing what the current U.S. trade policy, quote unquote. I put policy in quotations because it changes from day to day. It's not a real policy. It's more spasms of thought. But the spasms of thought and the rules that follow them are unfailingly bad. So let's start with the first myth
Like the Industrial Revolution impoverished workers. Is this something that people still say? Like,
to the extent that a lot of people talk about it, I think it's still a widespread belief. In writing the book, I spent a lot of time surveying college level and even high school level textbooks, current ones, ones that are currently being used, published in the last 3 or 4 years. And sure enough, it's there and stated as a matter of fact, as if it's an indisputable historic reality that the Industrial Revolution impoverished people. I think the general theme that runs through most of these books is that, well, it may be that eventually the Industrial Revolution enriched ordinary people, but it did so only by first greatly impoverishing the vast majority of people. It crushed people beneath the boots of the early capitalists. And it's just not true.
That's there's some sort of nostalgia also for a time where everyone was an independent worker and
everyone was dying of diarrhea and their children and their children were the fact is there's this false belief that people in the past before industry lived these idyllic, if somewhat Spartan lives, but they were happy. You can read I read Frederick Engels really for the first time before writing this book. His 1844 or 1845 book, the title escapes me now. And he says, oh yeah, prior to the Industrial Revolution, these villagers, they were happy. They played games on the village green and they had no worries. And
you have these quotes in the book.
And it's just nuts. Life expectancies were short. Parents almost always had to bury at least one or two of their children. Husbands had to bury their wives quite often because women died very frequently within a few weeks after giving birth. Housing was miserable. There was no indoor plumbing. Clothing was homespun. And of course, the riches that we enjoy today didn't emerge immediately, but people did grow gradually richer at the start of the Industrial Revolution. Economic historians debate exactly when real wages for ordinary workers in England, no one doubts that the Industrial Revolution began in England. And historians debate exactly when do we see the takeoff. Some historians have it as early as the mid-18th century. Others have it a little bit later. No one has it later than the 1840s. But in looking at the historical record, it's quite clear to me and to a lot of economic historians that the Industrial Revolution was a blessing, not just for those of us today who are living in its aftermath, but to the actual people who were in it. The factory work in, say, 1840, of course, by today's American and British standards would be horrible. But by the standards of the day, it was quite good. It paid better, and it was better than working on a farm. No one was forced to work in those factories. And people voluntarily worked in those factories. And they left agricultural, the dreariness and the often danger of agricultural, rural life.
Yeah, that's right. That's because that's also at a time where most people work in agriculture in the U.S.
Yeah. So what we do in the book, we talk about the first actual Industrial Revolution, the one that happened in England, and then we talk about the Gilded Age in America, which is sort of like the Industrial Revolution in Britain. It's the era when America really begins to industrialize. America remained far more of an agricultural economy longer than Britain did, not surprisingly. We have a lot of land, relatively few people on the land. So the Gilded Age happens around, in the decades just following the U.S. Civil War. And every American schoolchild knows the fallacies about this. Well, the robber barons emerge, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie. They get rich by crushing workers, by extorting high prices from consumers. And it took Congress and to finally wake up to these predations to save Americans. And so if you look at what was actually happening in the American economy during that time period, the economy was was becoming much more competitive. Real prices were falling. Work time prices were falling. Real wages were rising. Economic growth was pretty spectacular. And we might mention this later. That economic growth was not caused by high tariffs. That economic growth happened despite, not because of the high tariffs. But America had a largely free economy. Entrepreneurship was encouraged. There were almost nothing in the way of restrictions on entry into various industries. And as a result, we had a lot of technological innovation. That technological innovation took advantage of the large economies of scale that were available in the U.S., and those economies of scale themselves were only further enhanced by the railroads and by the telegraph and later the telephone. And so for the first time in human history, you have modern entrepreneurial, innovative capitalism mixed with very large and expanding market. And you got the incredible economic growth that America experienced in the last half of the 19th century. But when the progressives came along, starting in the late 1890s and really getting going in the early 20th century, they mistook what they saw. They saw big firms as monopolists just because they were big. If they had looked more closely, they would have seen that these big firms, yes, they were big, and the successful entrepreneurs who owned them made a lot of money, but the prices, as I mentioned a moment ago, were continuing to fall. The wages were continuing to rise. Economic growth was remarkable. It's a fallacy to believe that these firms needed to be regulated by government because otherwise they were poisoning Americans' food and tobacco products. Just none of that's true. But these are the fallacies that were present at the time, and they have been handed down through the generations to American school children, one after another. And as I mentioned, we looked at lots of the textbooks that are in use today, and these textbooks report as a matter of fact, as if it's a matter of fact, that it's only by the grace of Congress and the U.S. government that American workers were saved from practical enslavement and starvation by acts of Congress with the regulatory moves that were made starting in the late 1880s.
And it's also, and this is, I guess, what you talk about in the second myth, right? It's like these idea that these robber barons and like there was like monopolies everywhere. That too is not.
It's not true. It's not true. You know, the great monopolist, the canonical monopolist, of course, was John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil.
Yeah.
And monopolists, if a true monopoly restricts output and raises prices and doesn't innovate. Standard Oil dramatically lowered the price of kerosene, which was its main output back then. It dramatically lowered the cost of producing. It was highly innovative. Output expanded enormously. By the time of Standard Oil was broken up in 1911, even by the time that lawsuit was filed in 1906 or 1907, Standard Oil had already lost a good deal of market share to new upstart oil companies such as Gulf Oil and Texaco. And so the economy was highly competitive then. Antitrust did nothing to enhance that competitiveness. If anything, antitrust diminished somewhat that competitiveness. The meat producers, the Chicago meat packers, as they came to be called.
Yeah.
They weren't poisoning Americans with rancid beef. A lot of that the myth about that came from the 1906 sensationalist novel by Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, which Upton Sinclair did not. It's a novel, and when you explore what he says in that book compared to the facts that we can, and there are a lot of them that we can discover about how meat was produced back around the turn of the 20th century, Sinclair, it was all fiction. It was just fictional. He made it all up.
Well, but did he pretend otherwise?
So the book was first published in serialized form in a journal, a socialist journal. It may have even been called The Socialist. He was an activist. I think he meant to exaggerate it was not an easy job working in a slaughtering house. No one ever pretended otherwise. Mm-hmm. But he exaggerated the realities of it. So he made up these stories about rats running wild and the workers killing rats and throwing rats into the vats, and then the workers themselves falling into the vats, and they all get cut up and put in our sausage. None of that's true. There's no evidence for any of that. But people believed it. The classic story goes that Teddy Roosevelt, as president, one morning is eating his breakfast sausage or eating breakfast, and he's reading Upton Sinclair, and he gets sick to the stomach. Oh my gosh, I'm eating all this terrible stuff. I'm eating dead rats and ground up human beings. Let's pass the Meat Inspection Act. I don't know if Teddy Roosevelt actually did that, but certainly the tales told by Upton Sinclair range from vastly exaggerated to simply untrue.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of reminds me of the stuff that people are now saying about Amazon warehouse.
Yeah.
So there are a bunch of things we knew, obviously, that you and I knew about the Industrial Revolution and the progressive era. It's like, what are the things that actually surprised you the most that you didn't know before you started, working on this book?
So what I learned, let me begin by saying, I remember reading once that Ludwig von Mises said somewhere that if you want to learn a subject, write a book about it. And I understood what that meant intellectually. Mm-hmm. But this really came home to me in writing this book. When I wrote my earlier book, Globalization, back about 20 years ago, I felt it a little bit. But writing this book really taught me a lot. Probably the single thing I learned most about was the Great Depression. Chapter 3 in the book is a long chapter on the Great Depression. And, I knew what typical economists who aren't specialized in economic history and macroeconomics know about it. There were no earth-shattering surprises that I learned, but the details of the Great Depression, what led up to it, what happened before, what went on during the Great Depression in detail, were fascinating to learn about.
Let's talk about this. This section. It's like the Great Depression was a failure of capitalism, which obviously we hear each time. It's the same. You have a section later on the financial crisis was also a failure of capitalism. Right. Every depression, every recession, there are always people to say that they're a failure of capitalism. But so the Great Depression, what is the case that people make about the fact that it's a failure of capitalism?
So we had the Roaring 20s. Americans were over consuming. And the income distribution was becoming highly skewed toward the rich. The rich, of course, don't spend as much of their income, a larger share of their income, as do the non-rich. And so by the late 1920s, this imbalance, this illogic, this contradiction of capitalism finally came home to roost. And so the historians are too numerous to count. Famous, credible historians are too numerous to count. Who say things like, because of the higher income distribution, Americans were producing far more than they could consume. So these factors are just churning out goods, and the rich who were grabbing ever more of the income weren't buying the goods, and ordinary Americans, their incomes weren't rising enough to buy these goods. So we got this overproduction or underconsumption, and that's what caused the Great Depression. So if you look at the facts, and they're not difficult to find, the real wages were rising during the 1920s, except for the very early 1920-21 downturn. Throughout the 1920s, real wages were going up. The share of income that went to ordinary Americans was not shrinking. It was actually rising. Simon Kuznets, the Nobel Prize-winning empirical economist, documented that many, many years ago. And Americans' consumption spending was very high. Americans were buying all these newfangled consumption goods, home appliances that weren't available before because electrification was coming around. The 1920s were a great time. There was no contradiction of capitalism that was being played out in the 1920s. What happened, and this I did know before writing that chapter, before we wrote that chapter, is that when the stock market, the downturn started in August of 1929. And of course, famously in October of 1929, you got Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. That was largely a response to the fact that the economy was slowing. And the Fed, enthralled then to this spurious economic doctrine called the real bills doctrine, the Fed refused to do the job for which it was created to do. It was created to be a lender of last resort, basically to ensure that the money supply in America's highly decentralized fractional reserve banking system did not collapse. And when 1929 hit, the Fed allowed the money supply to collapse. This is what Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz famously documented as and called the Great Contraction. The money supply contracted by more than 30% between 1929 and 1933. And you just can't have that enormous decline of the money supply and not suffer incredibly bad economic consequences. So that happened. And then what happened after this, and here's where the research got really interesting for me when I began looking at the details of first Herbert Hoover's and then, of course, Franklin Roosevelt's attempt to fix the Great Depression. But before the Great Depression, governments basically didn't do much. And the depressions, we had downturns, and they were short-lived. But when the Great Depression came along, in part because ideology had changed, first Hoover and then FDR, they did something unprecedented. They actually actively used the government in order to try to cure the Depression. Herbert Hoover bragged about how much he intervened in ways that no one had ever done before. It didn't help. And so he created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. He attempted to keep prices and wages high by government diktat, which is one thing you definitely don't want to do when the economy is suffering a downturn. Franklin Roosevelt only doubled down on that. And of course, Herbert Hoover also signed in June of 1930 the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff. Now, the Smoot-Hawley tariff didn't cause a Great Depression, but it certainly made it worse. So you had these interventions, and they increased under Franklin Roosevelt. And in the book, we feature, we give a lot of space to Bob Higgs's regime uncertainty thesis. And that thesis is that as the 1930s wore on, the hostility from Washington was toward free markets and private property was accelerating. And as investors weren't sure that the government wasn't going to confiscate their property, the government wouldn't enforce the contractual obligations that commercial transactors undertook. And so when investors have these fears, well, they don't want to invest their money. If you're worried that the government might, seize your factory or tax the returns on that factory so high that it's not worthwhile for you to build the factory, you stay on the sidelines. You don't invest, and that's what happened. Investment dried up in the 1930s, yeah. And it didn't really. We can't say for sure that it returned until after World War II. The one other myth, I think it's a myth. We think it's a myth. Phil Gramm and I do, is that the Depression ended when the United States entered World War II. Certainly unemployment fell. Well, it's no trick to reduce unemployment by conscripting large numbers of working age population. And you had war industries that arose that employed people. But in terms of a recovery of the economy, making people's economic lives better, there's no evidence that happened until around 1946 or 47, when things start to improve. And by this time, Franklin Roosevelt, who had grown quite hostile to private enterprise, toned it down a little bit when he had to befriend business people to help, to encourage them to help in the war effort. Harry Truman, what was not the demagogue that a lot of people believe that Franklin Roosevelt had become. The Republicans had surprisingly won both houses of Congress just after the war. And for all of their faults, the Republicans were seen as a more pro-business, pro-market party than were the Democrats. And so it was only right after the war that we can say actual recovery began. And it began, Bob Higgs argues, and I think he's correct, because it was only then, after the war, was there a return to a belief that market-oriented principles would once again reign. Not perfect, wasn't laissez-faire, of course, but market-oriented principles that rolled back some of the intensity of the interventions that were coming down the pike from the New Dealers. Mm-hmm. And if you look at what happened before the Great Depression, one very interesting episode was the 1920-1921 downturn. And it was one of the most severe downturns ever in American history. Started in January of 1921. And it hit its trough 14 months afterward in January of 1920. It hit its trough in March of 1921. And the initial downturn during that depression was much greater than was the initial downturn during what became the Great Depression. But one difference, a major difference between 1920 and 1921 and 1930 and 1931, or 29 and 1930, was Warren G. Harding. Well, Woodrow Wilson was in office in 1920. He was paralyzed with a stroke. He didn't really do much. Warren G. Harding wins the presidency in late 1920, takes office in 1921, and does nothing. And so the financial writer James Grant calls the 1920-1921 depression the last governmentally unmedicated depression, quote unquote, in American history.
And of course, it was short-lived.
It was short-lived because it wasn't treated by government, and it was severe, but it was short-lived. And we had not only full recovery, we had an amazing recovery. The 1920s were an incredibly prosperous.
And by the way, this is a reference back to your dedication at the beginning, right? It's precisely when the government doesn't intervene, it allows markets and people and entrepreneur and investors and all of this to learn from the mistakes and to recover.
Yeah. But one mistake.
I think it's a common theme of that book. But one of the things that I actually found really striking about the book is how much history repeats itself. Yes. So in a way, the first three myths is kind of like phase one. And during that phase one, right, like America is transitioning away from an agriculture economy towards a manufacturing economy with all the gains in productivity, increase in wealth, all of this, but also kind of all the myth that emerge about discomfort, about change, and blaming kind of the transition for some horrible things that just doesn't happen, but also this nostalgia for the past time. And in fact, a lot of the argument for Smoot-Hawley tariffs were one that really echo a lot of the arguments we hear now about protecting, about manufacturing, except they were like protecting agriculture, protecting farmers, protecting all of this. So it's like, it's really weird how how history repeats itself. So starting with the myth 4, we're entering the second phase. And it's like all the angst about the transitioning away from an economy where a lot of people are employed in manufacturing towards an even more productive economy. And so your chapter 4, and we're still living with this myth now, is that trade hollowed out American manufacturing.
Yeah, of course, this myth is very current now, and you're exactly right and wise to see the parallel between what was going on in 1920 as regards agriculture and what's happening today as regards manufacturing. Although American people will say about the 1920s that American agriculture was suffering, what was happening is that agricultural prices were falling.
We're going down,
and they were going down for two reasons. First of all, Europe was recovering, and so we had more, and so we were importing. The world's global supply of agricultural outputs were increasing, which is a good thing. We want people to eat more. We want people to eat, but also because of technological innovation. So you had farm tractors and better fertilizers, better pesticides, better packaging materials. Refrigeration was emerging. All of these things increase the supply of food, and that causes prices to fall. So you need fewer farms. You need fewer people working on farms. Many people in the 1920s took these trends as a sign that some vital American industry was disappearing. We're losing agriculture, and so we have to protect it. And you're right. Smoot-Hawley began as an effort largely to protect farmers, agricultural interests, and then other industrial interests piled on, and the thing became a free-for-all. And there were other protectionist measures in the 1920s designed to help agriculture too. And because people would look at agricultural employment, oh my gosh, it's falling, something's terrible. We have to protect this American way of life. And a similar thing is happening today. American manufacturing output isn't falling. Industrial output today is at an all-time high. Industrial capacity in America is at an all-time high. What is falling, as you know, is the portion of the workforce employed in jobs that are classified as manufacturing jobs. That the post-war peak for that was in 1953, and so we're just ending the Korean War. And then it was about 31%, 32% as a share of the workers in manufacturing. Today it's down to 8%, and it's fallen pretty steadily ever since. There was no major acceleration of the trend of the decline of manufacturing employment as a share of total employment when NAFTA was implemented in 1994, or when America last started running trade deficits on an annual basis in 1976, or when China joined the WTO in 2001. It's been falling steadily for longer than my lifetime. And I've lived by now a long lifetime. And much of what drives the trade debate today is this utter fallacy that America doesn't make things anymore, that America can't be rich unless there's a return of manufacturing, and manufacturing hasn't left America. What has left is manufacturing jobs in the very same way that agricultural jobs were leaving 100 years ago.
Yeah, it's really, it's so frustrating because, of course, right, this is really political and policy consequences with basically tariffs that are like worse than even Smoot-Hawley's tariff. I mean, seems to be making the same mistake, creating the same regime uncertainty that we saw during the Great Depression. I mean, it's really astonishing. It's astonishing.
There's one way in which the current what's going on now with the Trump 2.0 tariffs is worse than Smoot-Hawley. Smoot-Hawley at least was enacted by Congress, so there was a congressional deliberation over it. Now, it's a pork barrel piece of legislation, of course, But now you have one man, the president, Trump, changing on a whim, day to day, what the tariff rates are going to be, who's going to pay, on who the tariffs will be implemented, what goods and services will be tariffed and which goods and services won't. And that's a source of, I think, far more uncertainty, or at least more uncertainty than there was unleashed under Smoot-Hawley.
And yet the cronyism remains actually the same, right? Because it's like a lot of the Smoot-Hawley decisions were kind of pushed by special interest wanting tariffs on their competitors. But here you have the same thing, right? With the tariff exemption, it depends on who can whisper and make a case in the ear of the president to actually get an exemption. It's just kind of, and that's one of the reasons why we hate protectionism isn't just like the interference with the market economy and the moral case, that we should be able to buy whatever we want. It is really kind of, it's filling up the swamp with the cronies that are, if you're well connected, there's a better chance that you will get an exemption and everyone else can be damned.
Yep. It's an unholy alliance between venal special interest groups and a president and a presidential team that is genuinely ideologically committed to this destructive regime of protectionism. It's the worst of all worlds. It's what Bruce Yandel would call Baptists and bootleggers. The Baptists here are the true believing protectionists, such as Trump. He's completely wrong, but he genuinely seems to believe it. And then that, of course, it's done in Washington, and which is a swamp, literally a swamp.
Yeah.
So the special interest groups that you mentioned are always on site, and of course they're going to have their say and get their exemptions and special privileges.
And the thing that's also really kind of interesting and stunning is the fact that the reason why, so Smoot-Hawley was passed by Congress, right? Yep. And that was before the delegation of trade, a lot of the trade authority to the president. And it was precisely, the delegation happened precisely because there was a recognition that Congress were more likely to be subjected to special interest and hence protectionist. Yeah. And meanwhile, the president, who was supposed to represent the nation, was less likely to be protectionist. And now it's like President Trump has like flipped this on his head.
Yes.
It's so weird.
But it's important to point out that what was delegated. It started in 1934 with the reciprocal trade agreements, the RTAA, reciprocal tariffs. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it's slipping my mind now, the exact name. What happened in starting in 1934, was a delegation by Congress to the president to negotiate trade agreements that basically Congress would vote up or down on. It wasn't a delegation of complete discretionary authority to raise or lower tariffs. What Trump is using is not that kind of power. Trump is using another kind of delegation, some emergency act that I think dates back to the 1970s. Doesn't mention tariffs at all. And it's clear from the text and the history of that particular piece of legislation that Congress meant to give the president the power to act quickly in the event of a true national emergency, military strikes or perhaps, some natural disaster calamity. Trump is saying that America's trade deficits are a national emergency. Well, my gosh, how can they be a national emergency? I like pointing out now that America started its annual string of annual trade deficits in 1976. That's the year I graduated from high school. Mm-hmm. We're still running those trade deficits. This year, 2025, will be the 50th straight year. How can you run nothing that goes on for 50 years where there's been no calamity, but American real wages are as high as there ever been. American prosperity is as great as it's ever been, except for the past few weeks. The stock market is as high as it's ever been. It's not an emergency, but Trump is abusing this power, and it's distressing to me, and I know also to you, that Congress is too supine to do anything about it.
Well, and he also, he spends, in the stuff he says, he shows often that, or says or does, that he doesn't even believe that it's a national emergency. For instance, the 100% tariffs on foreign movies. Yes. As like, this has nothing to do with, with national emergency and or national security or whatever. And the other thing is, like, if it were about China, right? If it were really truly about China, it wouldn't be like he would not be imposing a 10% across the board tariffs on our allies and on literally everything, including stuff that have nothing to do with national security. I mean, it's all just completely, it's really astonishingly baffling. And to me, that the president is utterly incoherent about this is one thing. The fact that he has enablers who we know are understand economics.
Some of them.
And I'm excluding Peter Navarro.
Even though he's PhD.
It's just astonishing. And they're actively out there, like, trying to defend the incoherence is really stunning.
I can't explain it. There's no way I could do it, and I know there's no way you could do it. But there are people who can do it, and they do it. But when you try to justify inherently incoherent policies, you will inevitably yourself be incoherent, and that's what these justifications are.
Yeah. I want to finish by talking about the income inequality as a market failure briefly, because I think I remember from earlier on when I said, there seems to be like the book could have been part 1, right? And that would be myth 1, 2, and 3. And then the second part would have been myth 4, 5, and 6. And then, or 7, I guess. And you mentioned several times that the argument that the growth in wealth and the distribution in wealth was growing, the inequality was growing. So it seems to be a recurring, again, argument that was present in some of the in the progressive era and in basically the past myth about capitalism. So can we talk about that part?
You bet. Yeah.
So what's kind of much of the inequality discourse focuses on pre-tax, pre-transfer numbers, and that's problematic. Can you what does a full accounting of household income really show?
So when you take account of after-tax, after-transfer incomes, the differences, if you look at pre-tax, the differences between the top income, average income in the top quintile and the average income in the bottom quintile are huge. But when you look at the taxes that the wealthier income earners actually pay, and you take account of the actual cash transfers of what the poorest people receive, that difference is cut dramatically. It's cut to about a quarter of the precise numbers are not in my head now, so I'm not going to try to quote precise numbers, but it falls dramatically. There's far less income inequality in America when you look at, as you should look at, post-tax, post-transfer. America has one of the most progressive income tax systems in the world, but it's politically convenient, of course, for those people who want to make a case for even higher taxes or more redistribution to deny that or to overlook that or to hide that fact. But ordinary Americans or poor Americans don't pay that much in the way of income taxes. High income earning Americans pay a lot, the overwhelming bulk of the income taxes in America paid by high income earners. And a lot of that is redistributed in one form or another to people much lower down the income distribution. So it just isn't the case that income inequality, even if you look at, and an important distinction has to be made here, even if you look just at dollar monetary income, that income isn't as unequal as it appears when you look at just pre-tax and pre-transfer. But even more importantly, more fundamentally, what matters ultimately isn't how many dollars you have in your purse or your bank account. What matters ultimately is your living standard. What kind of goods and services can you purchase? And when you look at living standards, the goods and services that are affordable by people all across the various income categories, you find that what I call consumption equality has increased, or consumption inequality has decreased. The goods and services available to even the poorest Americans today, many of those would have been the envy of middle class and even rich Americans just 3 or 4 generations ago. So the actual monetary measures of income inequality are biased upward, and the failure to account for what really matters, namely real access to real goods and services, that failure also paints a false description of the differences between rich and poor Americans. There are differences, of course. Jeff Bezos has his own private aluminum tube to fly around the world in. You and I have to share an aluminum tube with a few hundred other people when we want to fly. But we're flying. Ordinary Americans fly today on a regular basis in a way that ordinary Americans didn't fly in 1975, to pick just one example.
Yeah. Well, that's all the time we have now, but I really highly recommend this book, The Triumph of Economic Freedom, Debunking the 7 Great Myths of American Capitalism by Phil Gramm and Don Boudreaux. And by the way, at the end, at the back of the book, you have really great endorsement. I mean, Larry Summers, George Will, Amity Shlaes, Arthur Brooks, Jason Riley, Vernon Smith. And these are this is a great kind of mix talking about diversity. This is great. So congrats on the book. This is wonderful. I hope a lot of people are going to read it. More importantly, I hope a lot of people will learn from it and become great advocates, against these myths. So thanks, Don.
Thank you, Vero.